Good morning. So, I decided completely on my own, without any outside influence, that I was going to make a game with Python and Pygame. I thought it was going to be pretty fun to try something new, and it would be really cool to learn a new language and progress my programming knowledge. Python and Pygame seemed like a perfect opportunity to do this. Python is a very popular language that I've heard quite a lot about, and I've seen a couple of videos that use Pygame. So, with very little thought into it, I started right away. First up in the list of tasks that I had to complete was actually getting Python and Pygame installed and running. This wasn't super hard, but it wasn't as easy as Unity is. For Unity, you can just go to Unity's website, download the hub, and from there everything is pretty much taken care of and ready to go. Pygame was a little bit different. I had to first download Python proper, which was pretty easy to get going, but to get Pygame, I had to install the extension, which required me to do some stuff in the terminal, which is always scary for me. But with not that much work, I also got that finished. So, Python comes with its own very basic code and text editor. This was cool and all, but I still love my precious VS Code. This wasn't going to cut it for me. After a bit more work and one YouTube video later, I got Python all set up in my glorious dark VS Code. Now that everything was all installed and ready to go, it was the time that I was both dreading and looking forwards to the most: actually programming in Python. This was scary for a list of different reasons. The biggest of all was me having no clue what Python code actually looks like or how it works at all. But sitting around wasn't going to make it easier, so I just swallowed the bullet and went for it. I started following a very basic Pygame tutorial. It wasn't much of actually following the tutorial. Instead, it was just copying down what they wrote word for word. After copying down what seemed like total nonsense, I pressed play, and I got my first Hello World, the first big step into any programming language. From there, I found another tutorial that was actually super helpful. It's probably one of my favorite tutorials I've ever followed. It followed a very iterative process. They would show you the code for the entire step. You could run the game and see it running on your own hardware. Then it would go through and explain every single function and anything even remotely tricky. After it would explain all of this, then the next step would add just a little bit to the code and the functionality of the game and explain everything that it changed. It repeated this process a couple of times, and I actually started to grasp the basics of programming in Python. In the end, you end up with a pretty neat endless runner game that was pretty well fleshed out. If any of you are interested in this tutorial, then I'll have the link for you down in the description. With this tutorial done and a game somewhat made, I decided that I knew enough about coding in Python and that I could start adding some more features to the game. I was pretty confident in my abilities, so I jumped in head first. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. I couldn't even get a function that resets the game working. I tried for a solid hour before I decided to just give up on my hopes and dreams and work on another feature in this game. Instead, I worked on having more obstacles to dodge in the game. And after way too long of bug fixes, I actually got it working. There were now 2 cars racing towards you. Boom. I'm so good at coding. With the cars racing towards you, it didn't feel right that the ground was still remaining stationary. So next on the chopping block was to get the background scrolling. This used pretty much the same movement that the cars used, so it was almost identical to get up and running. At this point, I was actually starting to get the hang of things. I still wasn't the most confident, and I still had to Google stuff all the time, if you couldn't tell by my 42 open tabs, but it was still coming along really good. It was then time to go back and redo what I failed and make the game restart. Up until this point, when you died, there was just a death screen, and a couple seconds later, the whole program would just shut down. So I made the game loop over whenever you die, and after many Google searches later, have buttons to control the menus. It was still going really good. Python was pretty fun to code in, but there were still some things that I would get caught on. I kept leaving sneaky little semicolons while I was coding, and for the life of me, I couldn't get used to the top left of the screen being 00 versus the bottom left being 00. Like, it doesn't make any sense that the top would 0 and it would increase as you went down the screen. But whatever, enough ranting. This was pretty much all I had in mind for this tutorial project. I followed the tutorial through the main game loop and then added on extra functionality all by myself. So feeling ready, I jumped into the adventure of having to create my own game. But here comes the first and sometimes the most difficult part, actually coming up with a fun idea. I thought over this for quite some time, and from when I first got Python and Pygame, this question had been rattling around in my mind. I knew I wanted it to be about a snake. Get it? 'Cause I'm coding in Python? But that leaves a lot for me to come up with. I also need it to be pretty simple, 'cause this is my first project that I'd be working on in Python. So I don't want to bite off more than I can chew. I had a couple of ideas in mind, so I just decided to go with one of the easiest ones. I'll just have a snake who's slithering around in an infinite runner type setting, trying to avoid obstacles and collect coins. Simple, simple. This would be pretty similar to the tutorial I was following, so I was confident that I could make this work. First up, I decided I was gonna draw the art first. Usually I put in temporary assets, but this game was simple enough that I might as well put in the real assets from the get-go. Right at the beginning, I had to choose a screen size and color palette. I decided to go with 1080 by 720 because that's a fairly common screen size and it looked pretty good. Next up, I went to LawSpec, as usual, got an amazing looking color palette, and started to work on the art. I made a pretty basic grass background with a brilliant blue sky. From there I started drawing the snake. I didn't really know what I was going for with the snake. My first iteration was not very good at all. I needed to make the head cartoony while still being able to resemble a snake. After a couple of tries, I got something that I was pretty happy with. Now that the head was down, I shifted my attention to the body. This was going to be simple, a couple of circles that I just pile on behind the snake to make it look like a fluid moving body. After wrapping up the snake, it was time to move on to some of the obstacles that the snake would have to face. I started off with a big strong rock. From there it was the splishy splashy puddle, and finally the goofy Mr. Stump. These were all the obstacles our pal the snake would have to dodge on his adventures. Finally, after that we were left with the shiny old coin, and some clouds which I didn't even bother adding into the game. And ta-da! All of our art laid out. Now it's time to dive into the code and not pop out till I had finished the game. I opened a new project. A lot of this early work was pretty simple and straightforward with setting up the screens and different sprites. After the real basics were done, I could start working on more of the gameplay side. First off, I needed the player to move along the edge of the screen and the ground to scroll underneath him. A lot of this was the code that I had already written for the tutorial project, so I even opened them up side by side so that way I could remember how a lot of the things worked in Python. This was relatively easy, and soon the ground was zooming underneath the snake's maneuvering head. I also wrote the Python version of a switch statement, which doesn't sound very cool and quite frankly isn't. But I was happy with it, and I wrote it in my notes, so it must have been somewhat important. Following after that, it came time to add in the obstacles. This again was pretty similar to what I had written in my other project. The only thing that made these special and somewhat challenging to add was the fact that I needed to randomize what obstacle they were going to be. But with only a few lines of code, this was working with minimal effort. The coins were easy enough to add with almost the same code as the obstacles. It seemed like in almost no time at all, I was flying through this project. And I was almost at a state where there was a finished game loop. Crazy, I know. Following that, I began to get the infrastructure all set up for all the different menus and states that the finished game would have. I hadn't made the menus yet, but it was set up in a way that I could put them in at any time. Having this done, I could now have it built up that when the player dies, he respawns just a couple of seconds later and keeps going. I was really getting some progress done in my game. It was time to work on the small little details. I hooked up the coins, so every time you collected one, the counter at the top of the screen would tick up and it would internally save your highest score. The menus were next in the line to be worked on. I made a screen and set it up for both the start and the end screen, and obviously it's still temporary. All this work on menus and polishing the game was all to delay this one detail that I still needed to add. I'd been putting off adding this feature in fear of doing anything actually difficult programming in a language that I wasn't familiar with. It had finally time to come to add the snake's body in. I wanted the body to follow behind the head with a half second or so of delay. But how would I go about doing this in Python? I knew how I would do it in Unity, but this was a lot different. After quite a bit of thought and a bit of research, I decided that I was going to have a list that stored old positions of the player's head, and the body would just search through this list and take a certain object, so it was always a couple of frames behind the head. This was easier said than done though. First, I had to learn how to make and use a list in Python. Then I had to update the list every frame and finally read the right numbers off of that list. But with only one hair pulling mistake, I forgot some parentheses, it was running great. It followed just perfectly and really made the snake feel as though he was slithering around. Looked great, worked great, I'm happy with it. Now time to jump back into the busy work of menus and UI. I set up a cool backdrop for the start menu, but like usual, I was stumped on the name. After way too long of brainstorming, I went with Python's Adventure. Get it? Because the main character is a snake, and this is also my adventures coding in Python? Okay, I know I'm not the best at coming up with creative names, but I try, so you gotta give me some credit for that. With the main title and all the buttons in, that was all of the start screen down. And I hate to toot my own horn, but I think it looks pretty darn good. Anyways, I copied that over for the restart screen. I of course had to change up the title and some of the buttons. This screen also required me to show you the high score, but I got that nested in quite well, and boom, it's a finished game. Now it came time to try and struggle through trying to export the game. So first off, I have no clue how I was even going to do this in the first place. You see, Unity has an easy little button that says build and run, which leaves nothing to the imagination. But last time I checked, I don't remember seeing that button in VS Code for Python. So let's do some Googling. I checked up a couple of different websites and got a couple of ideas and tried them out, but nothing seemed to be working. So I kept going back to Google. I found this really promising Reddit page on r/Pygame, but this happened to be right in the middle of the Reddit blackout, so I was there left with answers that wouldn't work, but I kept chipping away at it. I found this one tutorial that seemed pretty helpful, but I kept getting this one error message, so I looked it up and found that I needed to download the Xcode command line tool. Easy enough. I followed the steps on how to do that, and 377 hours. I know my internet isn't the best, but holy cow. Okay, let's just postpone the build process for a bit. I'll get back to you if this ends up working. If you want to play this game, then I'll have the link to my itch page down below. It might be an executable, or it might just be some source code and raw files that you'll need to have Python installed to run it. Please feel free to try out the game and tell me what you think of it. So finally, here's an overview of my thoughts about Python and the Pygame experience. So overall, I really did have a ton of fun with it. It's always really rewarding learning something new and being able to do something with that skill. It was overall really satisfying having to do literally everything in the code. It felt like it was really productive not having to juggle the editor and countless scripts. Everything was all in one place and it was all run by code, which doesn't leave a lot of room for error if your code is written correctly, which led to a great overall experience. Now it's time for the things that I didn't like as much. A lot of this criticism is of Python, not Pygame. And of course, this is all my objective opinion with being super used to C#, the main language used in Unity. I'm sure if I used Python more, I'd get a lot more used to it and start to see a lot of these complaints in a new light. Right off the bat, I miss my brackets. Brackets just make the code way easier for me to structure and see what's grouped with what. I feel like brackets make the code a lot easier to read overall. Next up, I actually really did miss my dear semicolon. It's like the period at the end of a sentence, and it just doesn't feel right without them. There was also a couple of things that just didn't work how I was expecting them to. And even after a ton of research, I just couldn't get them to work whilst still not knowing what I was doing wrong. I could never really get functions to work how I wanted them, despite constant efforts, but I'm sure it's just some silly mistake or limitation. In Pygame, having the top of the screen being 0 really threw me for a loop, and I don't think I'd ever be able to get used to that one. And last of all, I can just tell that Pygame is not as powerful as Unity, which is not a surprise or a bad thing. It wasn't designed to be more powerful than Unity. But sometimes it's nice having Unity's wide feature set and support. I still don't know if I'm going to get a working build at this point of writing my script. Overall, I just miss my semicolon and brackets and can't wait for the loving embrace of C#. Overall, this challenge was a ton of fun. Learning something new and getting to try out and witness Python and Pygame's loving community was truly wonderful. If you have any ideas or suggestions for challenges or videos like this, or any suggestions at all, then I'm more than willing to hear them in the comments section down below. Thanks to the 3 of you watching this video. Dad, if you're watching this, then I can't wait to see you this weekend, but also, why would you be watching this? Anyways, thanks for sticking around this long. If you like this video, then please like and subscribe, or don't. I'm not your mom. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.
So, this is about and I to drive home. Yay!